Picture a kangaroo standing taller than most adult humans, weighing somewhere close to 3 times what a modern red kangaroo weighs, with a face so short and flattened it looked almost like it had walked into a wall. Now picture the fact that this animal, according to some of the most recent biomechanical research done on its skeleton, probably couldn't hop at all. It may have just walked, upright, on 2 legs, the same way we do. That animal actually existed. It's called Procoptodon goliah, the largest kangaroo that ever lived, and it's just one member of an entire extinct family of giant kangaroos that once dominated the Australian landscape, some of them so different from modern kangaroos that if you saw one standing in front of you today, kangaroo might not even be the first word that came to mind. Let's start with the basics, because even the basics here sound made up. Modern red kangaroos, the largest living kangaroo species today, typically stand around 1.5 to 1.8 meters tall and weigh up to about 90 kilograms for a big male. Procoptodon goliah is estimated to have stood roughly 2 meters tall, possibly more when fully upright, and weighed somewhere between 200 and 240 kilograms, more than double the weight of the biggest kangaroo alive today, packed into a body built completely differently from anything hopping around the outback right now. Here's where it gets strange, because the differences aren't just about size. Procoptodon belonged to a subfamily of kangaroos called the sthenurines, sometimes nicknamed short-faced kangaroos. And the name isn't an exaggeration. Their skulls were noticeably shorter and more compressed than a modern kangaroo's, with large, forward-facing eye sockets and a jaw built for a very specific, specialized diet. Instead of the small, delicate front paws modern kangaroos use mostly for grooming and gentle feeding, sthenurine kangaroos had unusually long arms, tipped with what researchers describe as almost hand-like structures, complete with what look like opposable-ish digits, capable of reaching up and grabbing branches, hooking foliage, and pulling entire tree limbs down toward their mouths to browse on leaves that would otherwise be completely out of reach. And then there are the feet, which is where this story gets genuinely bizarre. Modern kangaroos have long, narrow feet, built almost entirely around a single, massively enlarged 4th toe, perfectly designed for the kind of high-speed, energy-efficient hopping kangaroos are famous for. Sthenurine kangaroos, including Procoptodon, had feet that were dramatically reduced down to what was essentially a single, large, hoof-like toe on each foot, structurally closer to a single-toed animal like a horse than to any kangaroo alive today. For decades, paleontologists simply assumed this was just a more extreme version of a hopping foot. Then, in 2014, a detailed biomechanical study led by researcher Christine Janis re-examined the skeletal structure of several sthenurine species and reached a conclusion that genuinely upended the standard picture. According to that research, the specific proportions of the sthenurine hip, spine, and leg bones don't actually support the kind of repetitive, high-speed hopping modern kangaroos rely on. Hopping works incredibly efficiently for a kangaroo-sized animal because of specific elastic tendon mechanics in the legs, essentially storing and releasing energy like a spring with every bounce. But once you scale an animal up to the size and weight of something like Procoptodon, the study argued, those same mechanics start to break down. The joints and load-bearing structure simply weren't well suited to absorbing that kind of repeated hopping impact at that mass. Instead, the research suggested many sthenurine kangaroos likely got around the way we do, walking on 2 legs, 1 foot in front of the other, at least some, and possibly most of the time, reserving any hopping for short, occasional bursts, rather than as their primary way of getting from place to place. Think about that for a second. For most of the 20th century, if you'd shown someone a reconstruction of an ancient Australian megafauna scene, giant kangaroos bouncing around in the background would have felt like the obvious, natural choice. The actual science now suggests a meaningfully different picture. Enormous, short-faced, hook-handed kangaroos calmly walking upright between trees on 2 legs, reaching up with surprisingly dexterous hands to pull down branches, looking a lot less like a big version of the kangaroo you already know, and a lot more like something that needed its own entirely separate mental picture. And Procoptodon goliah wasn't alone out there. The broader sthenurine family included a genuinely wide range of species across different sizes and specializations, some considerably smaller and more modestly built, others rivaling Procoptodon in scale. Species like Cymusthenerus occidentalis, found particularly in southeastern Australia, shared that same short, compressed skull shape and grasping forelimbs, suggesting this entire branch of the kangaroo family tree had independently specialized toward a browsing lifestyle, reaching up into trees and shrubs for food, rather than the grazing on open grassland lifestyle modern kangaroos are built around. Here's a detail that helps explain why this specialization may have eventually become a serious problem for these animals. Modern kangaroos are famously flexible eaters, capable of grazing on a wide range of grasses and adjusting their diet significantly as vegetation and seasons shift. Sthenarine kangaroos, by contrast, appear to have been considerably more specialized, built specifically around browsing on particular trees and shrubs, using those long grasping arms to access food sources a grazing animal simply couldn't reach. That kind of specialization works brilliantly right up until the environment it depends on changes faster than the animal can adapt to. And Australia's climate did exactly that, becoming significantly drier and more variable over the tens of thousands of years leading up to the broader Australian megafauna extinction event, with many of the specific tree and shrub species these kangaroos likely depended on becoming increasingly scarce or patchy across the landscape as the continent's vegetation shifted toward the drier, more open terrain that dominates so much of Australia today. So when did all of this actually end, and why? Sthenarine kangaroos, including Procoptodon goliah, appear to have persisted right up until somewhere around 40,000 years ago, placing their extinction within the same broad window as the disappearance of most of Australia's other megafauna, the giant wombat-like Diprotodon, massive flightless birds, and marsupial predators among them. Exactly why this wave of extinctions happened is still genuinely debated by researchers, split between climate change reducing the specific food sources many of these specialized animals depended on, the arrival and spread of humans across the continent introducing new hunting pressure and landscape-altering fire practices, or, increasingly, the explanation favored by many current researchers, some combination of both factors compounding each other at exactly the wrong time for animals that were already highly specialized and had comparatively slow reproductive rates. Here's a detail that connects this directly back to something we've covered before, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. Some of the richest fossil evidence for these giant kangaroos, alongside Diprotodon and other Australian megafauna, has come from exactly the kind of exceptional preservation site we've talked about previously. Places like Lake Callabonna in South Australia, where soft ground repeatedly trapped enormous animals and preserved them in extraordinary, sometimes skin and tissue level detail. Sthenarine kangaroo remains have also turned up at cave sites across the country, including significant deposits in Western Australia's Narracourt Caves region, a site so rich in megafauna fossils that it's been recognised as a UNESCO World Heritage Site specifically for the density and quality of the ancient animal remains preserved within its cave systems. And that raises a genuinely fascinating question researchers are still actively working through. Did Aboriginal Australians ever actually encounter these giant kangaroos while they were still alive? Humans are now confirmed to have reached Australia at least 65,000 years ago, based on the Majed-Bebe rock shelter evidence in Arnhem Land, a discovery that pushed the accepted timeline for human arrival in Australia back by tens of thousands of years. If Sthenarine kangaroos persisted until around 40,000 years ago, that means there's a genuine, confirmed overlap of at least 20 to 25,000 years where humans and giant kangaroos shared the same continent, and quite plausibly crossed paths directly. That's not speculation stitched together from folklore. That's simply what the confirmed dates on both sides of the story currently show. This is exactly the kind of overlap that connects to something we've touched on before as well. Aboriginal oral traditions across parts of Australia include accounts of unusually large animals in the landscape, sometimes described in ways that researchers have suggested may represent genuine, transmitted cultural memory of actual megafauna, carried forward across an extraordinary span of generations. It's important to be careful here and not overstate the case. Connecting any specific story directly and definitively to a specific extinct species is genuinely difficult, and researchers rightly urge caution about drawing too straight a line between a modern retelling and an animal that vanished tens of thousands of years ago. But the broader pattern is worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright, especially now that we know with archaeological certainty that humans and animals like Procoptodon genuinely did share the same landscape for a very long stretch of time. Now here's a detail that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it. Procoptodon goliah wasn't a rare, isolated curiosity confined to a single small region. Fossil evidence places it, and closely related sthenurine species, across an enormous range of the Australian continent, from South Australia through into New South Wales and Queensland, suggesting these giant browsing kangaroos were a common, widespread, and genuinely significant part of the Australian ecosystem for a very long stretch of prehistoric time. Not some rare oddity, but a normal, everyday sight for whatever else was sharing that landscape at the time, humans very much included. And here's a bonus detail that a lot of people find genuinely fun once they hear it. Sthenurine kangaroos weren't the only oversized hopping, or in this case, apparently walking, animal roaming ancient Australia. The broader Pleistocene Australian landscape included giant flightless birds like Genyornis, standing well over 2 meters tall, alongside massive goannas and enormous marsupial predators like Thylacaleo carnifex, the so-called marsupial lion, an animal with a bite force proportionally among the strongest of any mammal predator ever recorded, built for taking down exactly the kind of large, slow-moving herbivores that giant kangaroos and Diprotodon represented. Put all of that together, and ancient Australia genuinely looked less like the familiar outback of red kangaroos and dingoes, and more like something closer to Africa's modern savanna ecosystem. A landscape of genuinely enormous herbivores, specialized browsers, and dedicated apex predators, all coexisting across the same continent for an extraordinarily long stretch of time, before that entire ecological picture collapsed within a relatively narrow window of a few thousand years. So what does all of this actually add up to? A kangaroo taller than most people, weighing more than double the largest kangaroo alive today, that quite possibly never hopped at all, walking upright on 2 legs and using surprisingly dexterous hook-like hands to pull branches down to feed. An animal so different from the modern image of a kangaroo that most artistic reconstructions of it look more plausible as an entirely separate species than as a giant version of something already familiar. An entire extinct family of these specialized giant browsing kangaroos spread widely across the continent for a genuinely long stretch of prehistoric time that may have overlapped directly with the first Aboriginal Australians for tens of thousands of years, before eventually disappearing as the climate shifted and the specific food sources they depended on became too unreliable to sustain them. And a broader ancient Australian ecosystem that, when you add in giant birds, marsupial lions, and enormous wombat-like Diprotodon roaming the same landscape at the same time, looked less like a slightly bigger version of the country's modern wildlife, and much more like an entirely different world stacked directly underneath the one Australians walk through today, separated by nothing more than time. And maybe that's the real story here. Not just one big kangaroo, an entire lost version of this continent, populated with animals genuinely strange enough that modern science is still actively rewriting how they even moved, hiding in plain sight underneath red dirt and dry lake beds all across the country you thought you already knew. Waiting, the same way Lake Callabonna's Diprotodon waited, for the next skeleton to finally work its way back up to the surface.